thinking time. What we try and do in ODI meetings is to have a discussion rather than just the backwards and forwards question and answer session, although you're welcome to ask the speakers specific questions if you have specific questions, but we're particularly interested in your comments and contributions to the discussion about think tanks. We identified some questions before the event, some more, as I suspected, have popped up during the course of the discussions. Jim talked about the think tanks being the source of the best ideas. Is that the place to go for the best ideas? I think that's an interesting question. Is it possible to identify organisations? Is there a correlation between organisations and ideas? Or should we be thinking more about the way ideas spread through networks, as Enrique talked about in his presentation? What is the most effective form? And then Enrique, at the end, brought us back nicely to a question which is, what should donors be funding? Donors are increasingly interested in funding think tanks. What sorts of think tanks should they be funding to do what sorts of things to make sure that they do contribute effectively to policy debate? So, as I said, it's on the record, it's also online. So what we would like you to do, if you have a comment or a question, is to stand up. Somebody will give you a microphone, speak into the microphone, say your name and the organisation that you're from very briefly, and then your comment or question. Try and keep it fairly short. We'll gather 2, 3, 4, 5, see how the conversation goes, and then we'll come back at the end to Enrique and James to comment on your comment. So, who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Oh, yeah. Okay, and then the lady over there.
I'm Veronica Broom.
I think so, yeah.
I'm Veronica Brooms, and I'm from the Commonwealth Policy Studies Unit, where I focus on corporate social responsibility policy and the link with foreign direct investment. And I was intrigued in both presentations because it raised the dilemma of many think tanks on how do you actually get funding that does not in any way cause your work to appear biased, so that you're not tainted by your source of funding. I mentioned the area in which I work on, which is corporate social responsibility and foreign direct investment, for the simple reason that if you work in that area, it's easy to find yourself into a situation where you're taking funds from a particular source that Commonwealth governments would not necessarily be interested in the policy outcomes that you're reflecting, because they'll think that you're a vehicle for the particular sector or the industry. So I'd certainly be interested in thoughts as to how think tanks can ensure that they're always above board and they don't run the risk of being tainted by their source of funding.
Okay, very good. Does anybody else want to talk about that sort of thing, about the support of think tanks, funding, independence, how to maintain credibility? Let's have a few about that, and then we'll come back to the lady over there, which is a different topic. Is that right? Okay, so yeah, please, let's go.
Hi, thanks very much for the discussion. My name is Brendan Whitty. I'm working on accountability of research organisations for the One World Trust. And a very similar question indeed. Basically, I was wondering if you had looked at how the funding structure, in particular, how it impacts on the independence and objectivity of the research outputs, or whether it was, or whether there was a sort of assumption on the basis of the funding structure of what the independence and objectivity of the think tank was perceived as.
Very good. Anything else in this area? Funding, support, independence, credibility. Yeah.
My name is William Hopper. I perhaps say I'm one of the founders of the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, but do not speak to the Institute, and that's a very important point because I'm not part of the academic staff of the Institute. I am interested in forming a new institute, and I'm very conscious of the need to avoid the problem which has just been raised. I think one approach that I propose to take is to find 10 funders so that the responsibility is widely spread and no one is clearly in charge.
Very, very good. Anybody else want to comment on that? Any funders in the room? No? Should we talk about those then? Jim first and Enrique.
Well, three very simple things I think address but do not entirely eliminate the problem because it will always exist. One is that the more diversified the funding, the more independence an institution has. Secondly, transparency is essential. It is in the U.S. The funding of any institute can be seen online. Any nonprofit, that's something that doesn't exist elsewhere, but I think is essential. And think tanks, I think more than other institutions, but need to have a degree of transparency in who's funding their research if it's to be credible and independent. And then thirdly, each institution should publish a policy that essentially outlines their approach to funding and how they maintain their independence. And there are certain models, the Rand Institution, Brookings, have them on their website, and I think that's an important element. And there are significant, there have been significant scandals in terms of individuals taking positions that were supported by a donor that had a particular interest, and they were reflecting themselves as a scholar at an institute when in fact they were funded by a particular corporate interest, and that was not revealed. In my mind, it is not only an institutional problem, but it is a community policing problem, because that single act undermines the credibility of all think tanks, and that it is essential that the pressure be placed upon the entire community to deal with that problem, because the ideas are all, and the credibility of the ideas is what really makes think tanks independent and effective and a voice. And to the degree that that is undermined, it really is, a very serious problem within the community.
I think I'll just be repeating various sources of funding. A good partner of us in Argentina, Cipec, spends a lot of time finding loads of donors, not just one or two, but a wide range of funds. Other think tanks in the region, Peru and CIE has been trying to get a trust fund set up where it's quite independent with a multi-actor board that conveys in some sort of degree of independence, etc. But I think the issue of credibility or objectivity is always going to be, to some degree, depending on who is looking at the think tank. So you might have very, very sort of diversified or independent sources of funding, but depending on your context, you might be seen as not independent. You might be seen as an organization working for somebody's interest simply because of what your evidence is suggesting. So the other point is to be very credible when it comes to your research methods. When there's no doubt about that, you might be able to argue for that.
I think it should also be said that it's not just financial. That an institution has must maintain distance from being too close. You want to be close enough to government to have influence, but you don't want to be so close that you're in and influenced by that, and the individuals who are on the board and who are affiliated with the institution can undermine its credibility just as much as having funding from a sole source that influence. And I think the other point I would make is that the independence of think tanks is affected by what is not funded. So that there is, the independence is violated in part because the nature of funding these days is so highly specialized, so that institutions don't have the latitude, and donors can essentially influence what think tanks say because they are forced to take funding that is specialized without there being any specific dictate, which influences, if the institution had its own druthers, it would not necessarily research that, conduct research on that issue.
Great, thank you very much. And let's move on to another topic. What was the topic that you were wanting to raise?
I'm a kind of anomaly here, actually. I'm a theologian.
Hang on, hold on a sec. The microphone's on the way.
Yes, I'm just saying that I'm perhaps an anomaly in this room because I'm a theologian, not many other discipline that would be relevant at this moment. My name is Louisa Poole, and I was wondering, really, in connection with the whole, I'm very interested in the whole idea of the think tanks and how they operate. And I heard Peter Sutherland, who, IMF and European Commissioner, and talking about the influences on opinion around the world. He seemed to think that faith groups quite often act as think tanks in many places and on an international scale. And I was wondering how you would evaluate, what is success in terms of think tank-y? What do you consider success to be? Or are you just a self-perpetuating sort of club that people of one of us can join? That kind of mood about them. What that they exist at all is obviously extremely important, that people get together who think and want to share their thoughts. And the spread of ideas is extremely important. But the question arises, what ideas? And whether these are ideas that are simply generated in university land, as it were, or whether, in fact, there's any kind of understanding, and that's one end of it. The other end of it would be a kind of, a new kind of imperialism that sees the think tank movement, if you want to call it that, as expressing a kind of spread of ideas that would be seen as inimical to some other cultures around the world. There is a clash of ideas in relation to think tanks that one can discern in certain places. I'm wondering if you could take up any of this and say something about it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So two elements to that. I think one was about what is success, and actually we have a request from an online viewer, Antonio Sicilioni from the Think Tank Initiative in Montevideo, who asked Jim, can you explain the criteria for choosing the top 10 think tanks in Latin America, and mention some characteristics of them. So let's park those two bits of the question for the time being. And does anybody want to pick up this other idea that Louisa's raised about either about faith groups, other forms of think tank organisation, or about where the ideas come from? Okay, he's still in the front.
Hi, my name's Kate Carroll, and I work for ActionAid in what's called the Knowledge Initiative, which, depending on many definitions, could be a sort of internal think tank. ActionAid isn't a faith-based organisation, but what I was interested that you were saying, Louise, is around where the ideas come from. And it's something that I'm kind of all too aware that within development organisations, it's very easy to have this blue sky thinking, which is not necessarily connected to what is coming out as the new ideas and new priorities for communities, and so for our kind of constituency, in a sense, it would be poor and vulnerable people. And so what I'm found particularly interesting about these presentations is how the go-to think tanks are often those that have linkages in both the North and the South. And I think that that's a particularly interesting area to think about, is how do different think tanks in different parts of the world communicate and develop ideas collectively? And how do we ensure that the types of ideas that are generated aren't necessarily those which are donor or funder-led, but come from practice and also feed back into practice? So it's more a comment than a question.
Well, very interesting. Where do these ideas come from? Nick, what do you want to...
Yeah, Nick Perkins from IDS. And, I mean, it's kind of related to also Enrique's example, actually, in Peru. And it relates again to this idea of independence. And I think that there are lots of different knowledge systems, different places where ideas can come from, and some have more credibility than others, basically. And I think that has a big influence on the kind of funding systems, for instance, that you might find yourself a part of. And the question is, by extension, go to for whom? You know, when you say go to think tanks, it's kind of, I think there's a big issue in there actually about credibility and how that's understood and so on. And it's something that actually vexes us quite a lot, because we kind of think actually development studies is a very loaded idea, and in fact there are lots of people who are outside of that usual arena of development policy, but who are actually quite significant drivers of social change in different contexts.
Louisa nodding over there. Anybody want to pick up this thread about sources of ideas, good for development, think tanks? Or should we? Okay, let's answer those two. So if we can have something from Jim and Enrique. First of all, perhaps on that thing, source of ideas, north, south, what kind of organisation, and then finish up with the criteria for scoring your think tank.
Well, I think there are several things. I mean, Enrique's visibility and funding dynamic as it influences ideas and think tanks, I think, is one dimension of the challenges facing think tanks. I think that there are an equal or greater challenges, the whole information, the flow of information, the availability of information, the management of information. And I look to the challenges facing journalists and newspapers. And they're similar, and I think think tanks should pay close attention to them because that's the challenges that think tanks face are very similar in terms of the presentation of ideas, the quality of ideas, the erosion of ideas, and I see that as much of a challenge as funding. And it does connect to what I call engagement or impact, because most donors, as you know, have this phrase of high impact philanthropy. And I think while you have to look at visibility and be concerned about it, you can't shy away from having and demonstrating the impact of your institution and being able to have a narrative that demonstrates the effectiveness of the institution. And then I would also suggest that the internet has as much a challenge as funding in terms of the erosion, the transformation of ideas, think tanks, and research. And then, in terms of the issue that you raised, I always see that there is, and this dynamic is changing by the things that I just mentioned, that there is an ecology, a intellectual policy food chain in terms of the environment that requires that you can't have think tanks without universities. You can't have the interdependence, not only in terms of universities, but the more advocacy-oriented institutions have to work together in a partnership. And some of that can be, as Enrique has identified, this new notion for institutions that are coming late to the whole think tank phenomenon, is that they have the benefit of looking at all the models. And there are clear dominant models in terms of the nature of think tanks, and they can pick and choose. And they can be 20% advocacy, 80% research, or mixed, and they have studios. But there has to be, in my mind, those institutions that are successful are able to effectively integrate an engagement strategy, but continue to have a high-quality product that is reliable. If they don't have that, you can have all the money in the world, and you can have all the access in the world and visibility, but it will be short-lived. Those institutions that endure are able to effectively engage key policymakers in the public. They know how to do it. Their scholars are savvy. And it's not every scholar, but there is enough to essentially make the institution successful. The other aspect that really determines success is understanding the policy environment. And it really is about leadership. If there's a common element that determines the success of think tanks, it's leadership. And really it's the head of the institution that defines it. And part of that is being able to know, not be right on every issue, but have enough winners that there is what I call this sort of intangible thing about how do you determine what the go-to think tanks are. People know what they are. There's what I call a critical mass of positive buzz. That in terms of the communities in which you work, people say that's the institution that you should be talking to.
I'll just stop you there because I think we'll come back to your criteria, and I think that might cover some of that territory. Enrique, do you want to comment on the kind of what makes a successful think tank, and also the where ideas come from?
I mean, I agree with everything James has said in terms of what makes it successful. I think it's a number of things, and the what I think was very important is the context, and whether the context is demanding knowledge from particular actors. And that, I think, links to the comment, Kate, I think you made in terms of being connected and whether that matters and where the ideas come from. And again, it's where these things have originated, and how they've evolved, and how the context evolved with them. If you're in Bolivia and you talk about your links with American or British think tanks, you won't be part of the policy process of the discussion, and your research, even though very good, might be discredited. If you're in Peru and you're talking about a particular policy issue and you bring in knowledge and research from American or British or French or Spanish partners, you will be credited with a bit more power of influence than any other. And if you're in Chile, you probably won't care, because Chilean organizations are seen by their policymakers and their peers as pretty good. So there won't be that need to get ideas from outside. The context will certainly matter in that way. And we've just been reviewing some work we've done with organizations and researchers in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Tanzania, in Uruguay, and that is exactly what comes out. And depending on the context, they will say, the academics and the policymakers will say, we're interested in the ideas that come out from outside, and sometimes they'll say, we don't care about the ideas that come from outside, we just want to see good methodological processes and good research and good presentation. That's it. That's enough.
Very good. Stephen, you wanted to ask a question. Does anybody else want to ask a question? So we're coming into the kind of last round now. I've had another question in from Sri Lanka, from the other side of the world. Very exciting, this, isn't it? Azra Abdul Kader, Centre for Policy Analysis in Sri Lanka, I think focused on your study, Jim. Did the study look at what sort of networks southern think tanks had within their own countries, their region, and with northern organisations in trying to influence and engage? So let's put those two together at the end and ask you to clarify your methodology and whether it looked at these things. Stephen, are you in this territory? You want something? Well, let's have another. No, you don't want to. Anybody else have another burning issue they want to explore, or should we let James answer these questions about your specific study, and then we'll come back to both of you for your final comments.
One thing I would add before doing that, in terms of Enrique's comment, is Victor Hugo has a great quote, which I think is made for think tanks: "As greater is the tread of mighty armies, is an idea whose time has come." And for me, the challenge of think tanks is to be able to bring ideas forward and to shape them. I mean, it's a no-brainer, it's no effort if the idea has come, because you just bring, that is there. The challenge for think tanks is to be able to bring the ideas forward in a way, in terms of picking the issue, shaping the issue, and communicating the issue to the public and policymakers. In terms of methodology, there is no differential in terms of the methodology I use. It was very simple. It was clearly stated, and in fact, you can go online to foreignpolicy.com or to my website at the University of Pennsylvania, and the report lists the criteria that were sent to all of the 150 experts, and then to all of the think tanks that participated in the process, that they were asked to use in their selection of the think tanks that were nominated. And then once the nominations were tabulated, they were then sent out again for people to review the criteria and then do the final selection of the top think tanks in the world. I have not looked at and considered as a part of the assessment. I mean, there is, on one of the criteria deals with the quality of the policy and research networks that the think tank has. So there's some degree, but I haven't done a significant, put significant, certainly within countries, weight on that, and that's just because it would be adding a whole other layer of complexity in terms of evaluating the networks. However, I've just been asked by Rutledge to write a book on global think tanks, and part of that will be networks. So I will be looking and have already started the research and looking at the role of networks, policy, knowledge, and idea networks around the world and how they relate to think tanks.
Very good. Enrique, any last comments you want to make?
No, I mean, I think the key thing from the Latin American work that was done was that it is not possible to separate think tanks from political parties or from the political system. They are, and they developed as part of the same process, first of independence, then of building a republic, and then of building a much more modern state, with all our successes and mostly failures. So whatever it's done in terms of supporting think tanks in definitely in Latin America, but I would be happy to say that in other developing countries, is that we must, as David Booth has been saying here, work with the grain of what is working in each country. What are the organization structures, what are the shapes, the forms that are working in each country to bridge research and policy, to get ideas, academic ideas, good quality research into policy and to inform policy processes. And one of the things that think tanks must do to be able to deal with this problem of funding and the problem of limited resources and spreading the chances is to focus on certain audiences, focus on certain policy issues, because that's how they are in the long term going to build up a portfolio or a good body of knowledge. That's how their leaders and their charismatic leaders are going to build good relationships with the people that matter over a long period of time, and that's going to be seen as the organizations to go to when a health issue comes up, when a catastrophe strikes a country, or when there is a particular urgency to address a free trade agreement and nobody thought about how to plan it. They will be the ones with that work. And it's possible that not all think tanks can be always influential, and some think tanks will have to work with others or just focus on their own space. And I think that's a challenge for us and for many international development think tanks who might be looking at a wide range of issues, maybe too much sometimes.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, James and Enrique. Very good, rich presentations, far more than we have time to unpack today. Thank you also for the comments and questions from the floor and our people connected via the internet also. We've touched upon many issues which are very important for ODI. We have a program on think tanks. We will be looking at some of these issues over the coming months and years. There's more information about that program and other work that ODI does out on the table outside. Jim has given you his website address. Ours is odi.org.uk/rapid. Lots more there. We have another meeting coming up next week within the RAPID program. It's not on think tanks, but it is on how civil society organisations contribute to policy, focusing particularly at how civil society organisations can play a role in budget processes, budget policies, advocating for more transparent and inclusive government. Mark Robinson from DFID, Paolo D'Orenzio from ODI and Oxford University, and Warren Krafchick, who's the director of the International Budget Partnership Project, will be here. That is next, whatever day, the 17th of March.